Hey everybody, Dr. Anderson here. Here to do a little bit of a recording for you about survey design, survey analysis, using the wonderful work of one of your colleagues to kind of show you some things that I'm starting to see as themes that some of your work has in common. Um, I'm going to show you guys an example of one of your peers and the survey that your peer put together. Um, Not because it's a particularly bad example, but because it's actually a really good example. And it's a good example that also has some of the sort of comments and suggestions that I've been making to a lot of people I was offering to this student. So as I was typing up the comments, I was thinking to myself, oh, everybody should sort of read this comment, or gosh, I've been giving this comment a lot, maybe I should record it. So thank you to your colleague for giving us the opportunity to use his work and to hopefully for all of you be able to grow and move forward in your design process using some of the wisdom you have gained by watching what they are doing. So, okay, well, let me share my screen because I want to actually show you the feedback and the work that this student is doing. And I am going to go right here to this quantitative tool. Okay, so you'll notice already, of course, on the side here that I have made these comments. So I'm just going to kind of walk you through some of the comments that I have made here. I'm going to pop in and just talk about the introduction. All of you need to make sure that you have an introduction on your survey. That introduction needs to actually do a number of different things that I hope you have read about. One of them is to introduce yourself as the researcher, the purpose of your research in broad strokes. You do not have to go into extensive detail. Don't give them a whole bunch of information about your motivation or your the research questions that you're trying to necessarily get at. Really just think of yourself. And if you were a person reading it, what do you need to know? You need to know, hey, I'm doing a study on principles and principal leadership in K-12 learning environments, and I am wanting to get information from my peers and from colleagues or from teachers about how they feel about principal leadership in that way. The other thing you want to do is you want to let them know relevant facts about the survey. And in most cases, those relevant facts are going to include anonymity and de-identification. So make sure that you let people know if in fact they are anonymous, which I would say most of the surveys that are going to be done as part of DELA are always going to be anonymous. And the reassure them that all identifying information will be removed from the survey, including email addresses are not being collected, like whatever reassurances that you want to make, but be clear about that. If this information is going to be published to your learning community, like to your school or to your district or to administrators, you want to let them know that. One thing, especially for those of you who are using your colleagues, whether they are your building colleagues or your district colleagues, is you want to let them know what's going to happen to this data. Say this data will be shared at a district-wide data retreat in the spring, all identifying information, including, names, email addresses, schools, grade levels, right? Just let them know that when the data is shared, if it's going to be shared in a context like that, that it will be anonymous. Okay. The other thing that you want to make sure that your introduction does is that it clarifies to those students exactly like, or not to those students, I'm sorry, to your participants, if there's sort of jargon or necessary information that they might want to know. My dissertation study is a good example of that. My dissertation study was talking about care. And in educational spaces, one thing that I know is that when you talk to teachers about their caring approach, they don't think about it in this sort of technical sense that I am talking about care. I'm talking about care as a philosophical and ethical approach that's been written about by educators, educational philosophers, theorists. no regular teacher thinks about the concept of care in that kind of technical way, right? So I needed to make sure that I was telling them, when I use the word care in this survey, I am talking about a caring approach defined in such and such a way. So if you have stuff like that, things that you need to clarify, jargon that needs to be made sort of specified to your participants, the introduction is another great place to do that. The last thing I'll say about the intro is, even though I said all these things and I've taken all this time already to say this to you, make sure that you aren't keeping them, that you're keeping them short. You don't want to lose people as participants because you have this huge intro that you're asking them to read, or in some cases, they'll just click through. And so if you have important information, such as definitions of concepts and terms that they might need to understand for your survey, if you have those in the intro and they didn't read the intro because the intro is too long, then you end up with this problem of reliability. Okay, so that's the intro. The next big thing I want to talk about that we have a really great example of here is ways that you can ask about things like demographics. There are best practices in demographics that you guys need to make sure that you're really getting sort of clear about and that you are using in your work. I cannot stress enough to you guys how important it is that you go and look at example surveys. Demographic collection of demographic information is political, right? You're asking people questions about things that might impact them and their lives, and that also might be defined by different groups and different organizations differently. You guys don't want to make a mistake about something like asking people about gender or race. You want to make sure that you are making decisions based on really great research, really great other examples, vetted studies, professionals who do this. I recommend that you look at some good example studies. Go to the National Center for Educational Statistics, which is a US government database. They have an excellent set of, I don't even know how many thousands of surveys you could look at there, but there are other spaces too that you can look at. The Annenberg has a really great space. In fact, let me really quickly, you guys will get to see how I organize my desktop here. Where are my journals? Here we go. You could go to the Annenberg Ed Working Papers and find lots of there's a ton of great quant researchers who post to this Ed Working Paper space. So go in there and look for surveys or look for things that are in here, K-12 education. And you could just put, so I just typed in principal survey. I actually haven't done this before. I'm like live testing this to see if it's actually going to work. So what you see here is, thankfully it worked. I kind of knew it would, but I was like, oh, you know how that is when you do an example for the first time in front of a group or on a recording. So look at this, right? So you could go through a school staffing survey for the National Teacher and Principal Survey. Now that's actually the survey I talked about first. That's a National Center for Education Statistics survey. So I used this survey to design my survey. You should do the same thing. And then you cite it when you write up your survey responses. So just be really thoughtful about the way that you are designing these surveys and the tools within them or the elements within them by basing them on great work that's done before. The other thing I want to say is that I've had some students say like, oh, well, do we really have to include demographic questions about race and gender? You do not have to do that. I would, however, suggest that you want to think really carefully before you decide not to collect information on that. When we are looking at education research, we always have to consider the harm that has been done historically and the way that our work is engaging in not just better work, but reparative work, right? We are a generation that must attend to repair. Marginalized groups have been kept out of analysis for a long time. In previous research and the history of research, it was very regularly not even considered what someone's race was or even what someone's gender was, right? And what we then saw were these sort of monolithic studies that presumed that all teachers were the same, that all teachers' experiences were the same, or principals or, elementary school bus drivers, whoever we were studying, right? If we don't collect that data, then we have no way of knowing where those marginalized groups are, who they are, and how this affects them differently. Because what modern history has taught us is that this sort of approach that has not considered those at the margins favors people in dominant groups, white people, cisgendered men. And so we want to be really careful that we are attending to that, that we are positioning our work to be about repair and investigation that really brings in those marginalized voices whenever we can. So that's my pitch for thinking that through. And when you are writing up your methods in your methods chapter, you will definitely want to address that, talk about it, and explain why you made the choices you made. Okay, so I want to scroll down a bit here and talk about these two questions. I've talked to a number of students about this, and this is a really important thing to consider. A lot of you have done exactly what this student has done. You've sort of like bunched your answers or your choices for people. It's like more convenient, right? Like, okay, I don't want to have 77 options on the page. And so I'm just going to go every 5 years, people put their information in. I get it. It feels really sort of expedient to do it that way. But I want you to ask yourself what analysis you do or what limitations to your analysis you enforce by actually creating these kinds of what appears to me random analytic categories. Every 5 years feels really convenient to you, the survey writer. But to you as the survey analyzer, this is a really dangerous thing to do. Now, grouping in categories like this can be meaningful, but only if there is purpose and meaning behind the categories that you've created. So for example, if you're asking your participants, how many years of teaching experience do you have? And you're asking them to just click between 1 and 5 years. Well, then you can't know anything about teachers between 1 to 5 years other than they are somewhere in that chunk, right? So the same thing for teachers 11 to 15 years. Think about on the back end, if you're pulling up a big data spreadsheet and you see that you have like 17 people have given you 11 to 15 years, 24 people have answered that they taught 6 to 10 years. So what you have is you have a huge chunk of your participants that are somewhere between 6 and 15 years of experience. What you can't know is, are all those people on the low end of that? Are those people scattered throughout that? Do I have a bunch of people in that sixth year? What if I have a ton of people who are in their 6th year? Arguably, those people might be perceived by you, or the analysis might be worthy of saying those are really early career teachers if you knew that they were in their 6th year. But if you only offer this block of like 6 to 10 years, block of 11 to 15 years, you can't really know whether or not those are really early career teachers or whether those are later career teachers, right? So here is what I recommend. I get that you want to make sure that you don't have this like huge list of choices for people to choose from. So go to Qualtrics, look at the tools that Qualtrics gives you. It gives you a beautiful tool that is a drop-down menu. If you preload into that drop-down menu, like less than a year, okay? 1 year, 2 year, 3 year, 4 year, 5 year. It'll let you populate it with as many years as you want. You could go out to, in fact, in the study that I created most recently, I went out to 50 years because we actually have people in the field who are at 50 years. What if you have like a huge, also think about that letter F there, 20 plus years, you might be looking at people who have a range of experience starting from me at the end of my classroom teaching career to my colleague who just retired with 43 years in, right? We're all lumped into the same category. So you can't do any analysis that sort of teases that out. But if you do a drop-down menu, you will see all the variety and ways of looking at people, and then you can actually create categories of analysis that are natural to your participants as opposed to this sort of construct. I hope that makes sense. I know it's a really complicated thing to think about, but all of the work of analysis that you're going to do is aided by all of this analytic thinking in design. So I'm going to add one more thing to it and talk to you about this is the question 15. How many years of classroom experience do you have in your school? I would say, hang on a second. Now that I'm into this, what was I going to say? Yeah, same. I have the same feedback for question 1.5, I guess. So yeah, so drop down menus. Oh, here's what I was going to say. Sorry. The only thing that I might say that would change my mind about having you use a drop-down menu versus these categories is if you have an actual analytic category or grouping that is purposeful. So for example, I was just writing this to another student that, you know, if you want to look at teachers according to the licensing standards in the state that you're teaching in, a lot of states actually categorize teacher licenses based on number of years of teaching. So in the state that I did my dissertation work, they call initial educator licenses. So licensing in the state of Wisconsin has initial educators, and initial educators fall into the first 1 to 3 years of teaching. And then they have master educators, and master educators, or no, excuse me, professional educators. Professional educators are the 4th through I think like 8th year of teaching. And then the master teachers, right? Like they keep going up. So if you wanted to be able to do some comparison between the sort of broader teaching community in your state, by aligning your categories in your survey in terms of the demographics of your participants to the analytic categories that the state has already determined, what you can do is pull up the data that your state Department of Education has collected on all the teachers. And you could say, look at what my teachers said as compared to the populations of teachers in the state according to these analytic categories. So if you use established categories that have some sort of purposeful comparison to the work you're doing, that is a really great reason to include these sort of lumped categories. Okay, moving along, make sure you are not forgetting groups of people in your, one of the things that your participants will immediately notice is if they are not included in your lists, right? And having an other category is okay, but what I find is like when you do other categories, people will put down acronyms. People will put down like these kind of vague, yeah, I teach, you know, ELDDs. What does that mean? I don't teach in your district. Teachers love an acronym, right? So if you're asking somebody something and they say they're an ELDD and you don't know what that stands for, then essentially that data is lost to you. So the more categories that you can include here, the clearer and more precise this listing will be, the better your data will be. Analytic categories in terms of where schools are, again, same recommendation, go to your state or national teacher organizations or professional organizations to see how like schools of ed or departments of education and see how they actually define these geographic regions. Not that you guys need to worry about this strongly, but I have a really good friend who her work is about rural schools, and she has beaten it into my head that there are tons of different kinds of rural schools. Rural schools are not one monolith, right? There's lots of things that sort of make one rural school different than other. And the other thing too is this is perception data. You don't know that your participants know exactly that they live in a rural area. Some might perceive themselves to live in a rural area because there is a farm down the street from the school. Does that mean that that's a rural school? I used to live and teach in a community that was not considered a rural school, but that there was a farm just down the block from our school because that farm had actually kind of been absorbed into the zoning plan, and the zoning line was drawn in such a way that his farm was still really close to this very clearly suburban area. So be thoughtful when you create these kinds of categories and know that everything will have a consequence in your analysis, and a lot of things could actually even impact your validity. So just, again, on surveys, this analytic work that you are doing to prep the survey will help make your analysis so much easier. Okay. The last big thing I want to talk about that I think that this student has really offered you guys some great insights into, and I'm going to be giving you some of the links that I have provided here in these comments, is the choice of Likert scale is very, very important. And when you are including a 5-point Likert scale, a 7-point Likert scale, a 4-point Likert scale, all of those things will have consequences in the analysis. Typically, neither agree or disagree is a category that is used by statisticians and quantitative researchers to signal to them that a person does not have an opinion. A person does not feel strongly. What some theorists argue is that by not having this category, you force a choice. You tell people, you have to tell me whether you agree or disagree with abortion, right? Think about something like that. There are lots of people who feel complex feelings about issues like abortion or issues like voucher schools, right? So what statisticians and quantitative researchers have said is that by offering a neither agree or disagree column, you provide people who feel complex feelings, maybe feel uncomfortable making a choice, you provide them a choice that actually suits them. But then what happens is that that data actually can't really be used analytically to tell us about agreement or disagreement. It tells us about a lack of agreement or disagreement, but it does not tell us about agreement or disagreement. So that data kind of ends up being pulled out. So if you force a choice, it's not a bad thing to force a choice. It's not a bad thing to take this agree or disagree out. You just have to tell us that you decided to do that. And then when you do your analysis, if you have an agree or disagree column, then you also have to be really aware of how you do that kind of analysis. You can learn a lot by looking at forums, especially forums on places like ResearchGate. You can see over here that I gave this student this ResearchGate forum where people, really smart researchers, are talking about these choices. And I find them often to be easier to understand than some of the professional papers that these same people are publishing, because of course they're publishing it in journals that you're reading for an audience that's like very elite. But when they're in a forum, they're just trying to answer questions for people. So it can actually sometimes be more approachable. You cannot possibly learn everything you need to learn about your Likert scale choices or your analytic choices from me in the videos and modules that I provide, right? One of the things about being at a terminal level, at this highest level of degree seeking, is that you have to see what the questions are that you need to ask, and then you need to chase those answers. That is what I did for months and months and months as a PhD student. And you guys are going to need to do the same thing. So if you're wondering, like, I don't know, is this the right Likert scale for me? Get out there. Start looking at the forums. Make sure that you're using really good sources. Make sure that the sources that you're using are being provided by people who are experts, right? Just check your sources. But I would say, be really aggressive, assertive, and proactive about like looking up what Likert scales are really going to be the right ones for you. Okay. And I think overall, in terms of if you're doing open-ended questions on your survey, make sure you're not asking too many combination questions. You want to make sure, like down here on question number 3, and how, just be really cautious about that. That's a really it's a lot to ask somebody to do in one question. So sometimes it's better to have two questions. What is it and how did it make you feel? Those are two different things, and asking people to go back and forth between two different categories or two different questions can actually give your participants an opportunity to be specific and clear with you. Whereas if you ask it together, it can sometimes get mushy and then your analysis can be complicated. But we're going to talk about that more in qualitative analysis and design in the next module. So I'll come back to talking about these kinds of qualitative questions in that module. Okay, thanks you guys. Hope this was helpful. Happy editing, keep going, reach out if you need anything. I'm excited to see what you guys are working on. Great.